Hey folks, Corey Knapp here. It is Sunday night this week. I apologize, guys. We're a day late, had a last minute conflict. Welcome aboard to the Big Bald Azure Guy AZ-900 Exam Bootcamp. Like I said, it is Sunday night. We're going to kick things off here. Let's do the intro real quick, and we'll see you back here for week 2. Once again, folks, welcome back. It is that time for week 2 of the AZ-900 Azure Fundamentals Exam Bootcamp. Before we get started here, it looks like Walter is early, as always. My friend Walter, thank you for joining. Time to learn. Let's go, he says. I agree. Just a quick level set. Last week, we took a look at cloud fundamentals. Now, I know some people are like, oh, it's more of a lecture. You didn't really demonstrate anything, things like that. This is where things start to get fun. You get to make things, you get to break things, you get to do whatever you want. I mean, we're going to play around in Azure, the portal this time. We might show you real quick some scripting. We're going to jump into Azure resources today. If you were on the fence about whether or not cloud could be for you, stay tuned for this episode. I mean, this week is where we start to really get into the really nitty gritty of what cloud's all about and how awesome it is. I mean, I've enjoyed a nice long career in IT going on 25 plus years, and cloud has been real fun for me the past decade. And I can say this is where it's been home for me, and I really love doing what I do. So without any further ado, let's kind of just kick back up where we left off here. And you'll see here, we are now in the Empowering Your Cloud Journey, week 2 of the AZ-900 Azure Fundamentals Exam Bootcamp. And as I said, today we're going to cover Introduction to Azure. No more cloud only. We're going to be covering some Azure Architecture, Azure Compute, and some networking. Now, we're not going to cover everything. This is a very, very lengthy section. We're actually breaking this into 2 weeks because we also have to cover next week Azure Storage and also Azure Identity, Access, and Security. So it's a big section. It's going to take 2 weeks to cover. I mean, we could do it over a 2-3 hour session, but I've also noticed that when I do training for people get that glazed over look after about an hour and a half. So to me, I want to keep things no more than 90 minutes. I've got some demonstrations I want to show you. I want to keep people interested and show you what this job is all about on a daily basis. So if we move forward here, let's shrink the size of the screen here a little bit, and let's go to our next slide. As I said, today we're going to cover Azure Architecture and Compute and Networking. We're going to leave Storage, Identity, Access, and Security for next week. And right now, the first thing I want to do is I want to jump into how do you sign up for Azure? What are we going to work on? Before we get that out of the way, I want to talk to you folks about, hey, we are going to be doing a lot of certification study exam boot camps on here. We're going to cover a lot of different things you can do with Azure to help out your cloud career, becoming a cloud engineer. We're going to lay out some roadmaps on how to become an Azure architect over the next 6 to 12 months, whether you're new, whether you're midway through your career, where you want to go next. If you want to be if you want to see all that kind of stuff, please hit the like button, hit subscribe, hit the notification button and the bell so you get notified whenever new things pop up. Also new this week, in the description for the video, there is the link for the new Discord server. Be the first one to sign up. I'll give you a free one-on-one for 30 minutes. If you also take a look, there is a link for my LinkedIn profile, as well as my top mate to reserve one-on-ones with me. And there's something else. Oh, and also the YouTube channel. Let's not forget about that. I have also spoken to a few people over the past few days. I have a collaboration coming up with my friend Dakota, the bearded IT dad. Some of you know him, and a couple other folks as well. So there's a lot going on. The podcast for interviews is going to launch here in about a week. So you'll see that here on the YouTube channel, not to mention on the podcast itself. So going back in so you can see my bald head at the bottom here, we're going to do a walkthrough right now of how to sign up for Azure. So let me share out my screen here, and we will add this. So you'll see here, this is if you go to azure.microsoft.com. You can also go to just Google Azure. Let me actually just do that for you right now. So let's go to Google, and we're going to sign up for Azure. You'll see here it gives us the Microsoft. Let me blow up the text here a little bit so you can see it. The Microsoft Azure official site. We'll click on that. Coffee is also life, so we're going to get some coffee going first. And you see here you have two buttons. You can start free or you can do pay as you go. Obviously, I recommend you're starting out here, you're going to do start free. What you get when you start free, there are a bunch of popular services that are free for the first 12 months, no matter what. And that includes 12 months of Azure virtual machines, which includes B1S and B2 PTS V2 and B2 ATS V2, AMD-based burstable VMs. You don't have to worry about the SKU numbers, things like that, but you get 750 hours of being able to stand up these VMs for free. Also get 12 months or 750 hours each of the same for Linux virtual machines. You get Azure SQL Database, 1,000 vCore seconds of SQL Database serverless usage per month with 32 gig of storage. You get 5 gig of locally redundant storage, hot block with 20,000 read and 20,000 write operations for Azure Blob Storage. We'll learn about storage next week. You get 1,000 request units per second provisioned with 25 gig of storage for Azure Cosmos DB. That is a different version of database. If you're used to SQL, completely different, but we will go through that as part of the training here as well. You've also got the Azure App Service. We'll touch base on that a little bit today. Azure Functions as well. You get your first million requests always free. And also Azure Event Grid, 100,000 operations per month you get. There's also, you can click on this to see all the free services, but I'm not going to spoil that for you. There is a ton of stuff here that is really, really cool. Also, there's 55 other services that are always free. And you know what? Let's just do all free services real quick. And you can see all of this. Automation is always free. The Azure AI bot service is always free. And that does include 10,000 premium channel messages and unlimited standard channel messages. Azure AI Customer Vision, Azure AI Metrics Advisor. You've got different things like Azure Database for PostgreSQL, Azure DevOps, 5 users with unlimited private Git repos. You want to go public, you got to pay for it, but you want to keep it private for testing, development, things like that. It's always free for the first 5 users in your group. Azure Kubernetes Services, AKS cluster management is free. Now, you will incur a charge for anything you do in AKS, but just to stand it up and monitor it and check out the cluster management, that's free to take a look at. A big one, Azure Lighthouse, where you can manage service providers with zero trust access controls. We're going to touch on zero trust next week, big time. I've taught courses in zero trust before. It's a passion of mine. You're going to love it. Azure Maps, Blob Storage, you get 12 months of 5 gig, like I said. Cloud Shell, 5 gig is always free. Container apps, data catalogs, IoT Hub, Key Vault, 10,000 transactions, standard tier, 12 months free. Load balancers, 750 hours at 12 months for free. Managed disks, 264 gig SSD storage plus 1 gig snapshots, 2 million IOs, 12 months free. All this stuff. Security Center, which is a background application slash, let's even call it a platform inside Azure that takes a look at everything you have deployed Azure resource-wise and makes sure that you have all of your stuff up to current assessments, does preventions, detections, recommendations for upgrades, things like that. Ton of other stuff here. We don't have time to go over it all, but I recommend you highly take a look. Also, Visual Studio Code, probably the best code editor out there right now that's free. Whether you're on Azure or not, it's 100% free. I suggest taking a look at it. In a few weeks, we will take a look at how to set up VS Code to do some very simple infrastructure as code. We're not going to learn how to be a developer. I'm not a developer, folks. I don't want to be one, but I'm very dangerous with scripting. I'm very dangerous with doing infrastructure as code, whether it's in JSON, whether it's in Bicep, whether it's in Terraform. We'll learn about these things over the next few weeks. And this gets kind of fun. Also here in the chat, that is my daughter. Hello, sweetheart. She is learning to become a security cyber engineer. So let's see if we can help her on her journey here. Going back, let's take a look here. So we're going to start for free. The first thing you're going to do is give it your email address when it comes up here. And you can do Gmail, you can do Microsoft account, you can do your own personal account, you can do your own Office account. It'll ask you simply for your address, your email address, your home address, and a credit card. I'm not going to go through that here because we're not going to share that information out for everybody. So you all can forget you're not going to get my credit card numbers. It's not going to happen. But regardless, once you put that in, and it needs your credit card to authorize it, just in case. What you get as part of your first month, in addition to the always free services, is you get 30 days and $200 of Azure credit. Once you go into that, once you get past all this, here's what you're going to see. So let me close this out, and we are going to share out, share screen, Windows. Here is what the Azure portal looks like. Let me blow this up here. Very simple. What Azure services that are out there, what resources you currently have in your subscription, all that kind of fun stuff. And me, because I'm a Microsoft certified trainer, I get $100 a month renewable every single month while I'm a Microsoft certified trainer to play around with things, develop things, teach different things. But as I said, if this is your first Azure account, you will automatically get $200 up front to play with to your heart's content. Now, I will warn you, got to be careful, and we will learn to set budgets so that when you hit your max, it turns everything off and doesn't continue to charge you, because there are a few items on here. For example, SQL, always on SQL, will run you a lot of money very quickly. We're talking a couple $1,000s a month just doing nothing. So you got to be careful about what you're doing. You're setting up budgets is very important. I have my budget set up for $100. So once I hit the free limit for myself for a month, it turns everything off. So good stuff to look at. And like I said, this is the Azure portal where you can create resources. You can take a look at the virtual machines you have stood up, virtual networks. We'll go through all of this step by step over the next 5 or 6 weeks. But I wanted to just give you a basic idea of what it looks like. As I said, subscriptions. This shows the one that I've got, my MSDN platform subscription, which is what I get as part of being a Microsoft certified trainer. Doesn't cost me a dime. And we'll show you how to take care of that once you pass a few exams, how you can become an MCT if you've taught a few courses here or there. It's very minimal to get involved, but as a lifelong, let's just say it is a career-long, there are career-long benefits to being an MCT, not just to being able to be a trainer and teach other people and learn things yourself, but there are substantial discounts, training programs. I highly recommend it if you're even very remotely interested in learning to teach this stuff to others. I should actually probably do a course on doing that as well eventually. So let's stop sharing this out real quick. Anybody have any questions in the meantime? I see we got a couple people here in attendance. Before I continue on, and I will share back out my slides. And first, we're going to focus on, isn't that nice? My beautiful wife, Wonder Woman, Michelle. Hello, sweetheart. And we're going to cover Azure Architecture first. And just so you guys know, in case you don't know, Michelle is the reason I do all this, as is my kids. If it wasn't for her, I'd probably be in a dumpster somewhere. No kidding. She has saved my life on more than one occasion. I owe everything to her, and that's why I do it, because I love doing it. I love her. So next slide. What we're going to focus on for this exam is, like I said, there are different objective domains. And I believe I initially said that about 30 to 40% of the first questions will cover Azure resources, things like that. We'll go back and review this at the end. But in this objective domain where we cover Azure Compute, networking, things like that, specifically Azure Architecture right now, this is what we're going to cover. We're going to cover, this is what's on the test, I should say, describing Azure regions, region pairs, sovereign regions, availability zones, other stuff like Azure, what's an Azure data center. We're not going to cover all this stuff because you should be able to look this stuff up for yourself, but you'll figure out what an Azure resource is, what an Azure resource group is, what's a subscription, what's a management group. And then you also describe the hierarchy of resource groups, subscriptions, and management groups, and what comes first, second, and third, what can encompass all that, how many of each can be in each one. Like I said, not technical, but it's the basic concepts that you need to know to pass this exam and do daily operations in Azure. Let's get into architecture in general. So let's focus on now Azure regions. Let me hide my face for a minute because this is a cool map. So if we take a look here, there are over 60 plus regions for Azure, covering over 140 countries. I wish I could blow this. Actually, maybe I can blow this up for you here. Nah, I really can't. But what we'll do here is you take a look. There is everywhere you see a blue dot is a different region. Everywhere you see the names, that shows what these countries are that have them. There are what available regions are there. There is an announced region. If you'll take a look down here, you'll see this. You can't blow it up too well. I will get the image sent out to you all in the GitHub. There's an announced region right now for Mexico Central. There's one coming up for Spain Central, one in Qatar Central. But you've also got availability zones. Well, you'll see, and we'll go over that, where you've got built-in HA and disaster recovery in these areas. You've got Canada East, West US 2, US Government Arizona, US DoD Central. Other things like down here, you've got South Africa North, South Africa West, you've got Brazil South. Um, all over the place, you've got different things. You've got regions set up for Australia East, New Zealand North, Australia Central 1 and 2, and also Australia Southeast. Anywhere for the most part that there are people living, they are doing their best to have a region centrally located for you. What a region is a region represents a collection of data centers. Pardon me, coffee time, dry mouth. And what these regions do is they provide flexibility and scale, and they preserve data residency. Now, the best thing to do, like I said, is when you have users in a certain region, you select, when you're building a resource or a platform of some kind, you select a resource closest to your users, so there's minimal latency getting that information off to your users. You'll always want to be aware of region deployment availability. It's minimal, but there are certain resources that cannot be deployed in certain regions. It's very minimal. You probably won't come across that unless you're dealing with global deployment of some kind. And there are some global services that are regionally independent. So, for example, Azure Front Door and Azure Traffic Manager are global services that, regardless of where you're at, you can use them. So that's just good things to know about Azure regions. Moving on, let's take a look at what an availability zone is. Availability zones, if I can stop having my screen super zoomed in, it'd be easier for me to talk to you. These are physically separate locations within an Azure region. I believe, last I heard, they are, I think, a minimum mileage between the minimum mileage or minimum distance between them. These take availability sets to the next level. It always includes one or more data centers equipped with their own independent power, cooling, networking, and they kind of act as an isolation boundary. If one availability zone goes down, the other continues working. So if you look at the document here, this slide, you'll see availability zone 1, availability zone 2, and availability zone 3. Just say, for example, this is US East 1, with the US East region. You've got 3 availability zones. If for some reason, due to a power outage, due to a catastrophe, due to a cyber attack, AZ1 goes down here, guess what? AZ2 and AZ3 still continue working. So there is minimal downtime for a user connecting to the US East region. As it says here, they provide protection against downtime due to data center failure. They are physically separate, but they're in the same region. So you may have 3 data centers within the same region, but I'll just say within 50 miles of each other. As I said, they have their own independent power, their own cooling and networking, and they are connected through private fiber optic networks, very high speed connectivity between these regional availability zones. When you're talking about regions also, what you've got to look at is region pairs. Each region in Azure is paired with another region automatically. Azure does prefer at least 300 miles of separation between the data centers and a regional pair. Some services provide automatic replication to the paired region. So you may have backups, you may have things like Azure Key Vaults, you may have things like Azure VMs that you can set up or automatically have automatic replication to that separate region. So if you look at the data chart here, you look at the chart here, I should say, you see here that North Central US is paired automatically with South Central US. So let's say Chicago and Texas. East US, West US, New York, LA. That's not where they are, but I'm just trying to give you estimations of where these things are. Germany Central, Germany Northeast, Southeast Asia, East Asia, and so on. So, in addition to having, let's go back here to the availability zones where you've got maybe 3 data centers in a single region, all within 50 miles of each other. At least 300 miles away, you have a paired region. So, like I said, East US and West US are paired automatically. And in an outage, automatically either East US or West US will be prioritized first. So you don't have to worry about it. If you have things set up so that their disaster recovery is set up to fail over from East US to West US automatically, you don't have to worry. One of them will be brought up first. And also, the really cool thing about this, Azure system updates, keep in mind, the back end of Azure is all servers. You're talking Linux, you're talking Windows, you're talking all kinds of stuff. You're talking services that have to be updated. System updates are rolled out to the paired regions sequentially, not at the same time. So you'll get Northeast done first, North Central US done first, then South Central US done second. So that way there is zero outage when you're doing an update, say for a service in North Central US, you're still running on South Central US. And then when North Central US is done, you're running off of that one while South Central US is doing the update. So you don't have to worry about that kind of stuff where it takes things out. There is a full list of region pairs available on the Microsoft website. You can go take a look. Just Google Azure paired regions, and you will see an entire. This is just a partial list. There is a massive list. On top of it, if you go just to Azure regions, you can get the entire list of all 160 plus or 140 plus countries that have regions available to them. So good stuff to know. There are a few special cases, excuse me, that are called Azure sovereign regions. For example, we've got one here. This is for US government services. These are automatically designed to meet the security and compliance standard needs of US federal agencies, whether it's state, local, places like Department of Defense, military. These are separate instances of Azure that are completely isolated from all the other non-US government deployments. So whether it's your small business or your large business, it's completely isolated, and they're only accessible to screened authorized personnel. We're talking simple things like, not simple things, but complex things like secured clearances, you name it. Whatever you need to access that government resource is the background check you have to go through just to get access to this data. So in addition, in addition to the US government region, you've also got things like the Azure China region. Microsoft was China's first foreign public cloud service provider in compliance with their government regulations. Now, keep in mind, China also has their own versions of public cloud that they use internally in China and in their territories. I couldn't begin to tell you what they are. But there is such a thing as Azure China. It's a physically separated instance of Azure Cloud operated by their local cloud service provider named 21 Vianet. All the data stays within China to ensure compliance according to their country standards. This is not a matter of who thinks who is right or who's wrong. This is just the bottom line is Azure China has to have their data stay inside China to ensure compliance. There are a few other sovereign regions, like there is a an Azure Germany, and a couple other ones. There's a couple other Azure US ones, and you'll eventually see them when you go online. You take a look at if you go to Azure Government or you go to Azure Sovereign Region, if you Google that, or if you're doing the Microsoft Learn lessons, like I suggested, going along with this training, you'll learn about all of those. Any questions before we move on to the next slide? Because like I said here, we have Azure China. We also have US government services. But before we move into Azure resources, I want to make sure nobody's any questions they want to have real quick answered. I know we haven't covered a ton, but if there's anything outstanding, I want to answer it quickly before we move on. So I'll give you 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, moving on. Azure resources. Any kind of component to Azure like storage, virtual machines, functions, SQL databases, app services, anything you stand up in Azure that's available to build a cloud solution is considered an Azure resource. Let's just get that out of the way. So basically, everything. Let's take a look here. The first one I want to talk about is resource groups. Basically, resource groups are containers for multiple resources that either share the same life cycle or the same or have similarities. Think of it as a bag that you're going to keep similar items in. It is a container. You stand up a resource group and then you manage and you put all those resources into a single unit. So, say you're going to stand up a bunch of virtual machines for a single purpose. You would create a resource group and you would throw, say, those 3 or 4 virtual machines in that same resource group. It makes them easier to manage. There are a few things that you have to pay attention to, and you should know this for the, let's call this an exam tip. Resources can only exist in one resource group. You can't have a VM in multiple resource groups. They can exist in different regions. So your resource group may be in US East, but the resources inside of it may be in US West. So remember that one. Resources can exist in different regions. And you can move them from one resource group to the next. Excuse me. All thing you realize is that applications can use multiple resource groups. You're not dedicated to using only your own resource group. This just makes things much easier to manage. You can secure things at the resource group level. You can secure them at the resource level using what's called role-based access control, or RBAC. We'll learn about that when we touch identity and access and security. And like I said here, every Azure resource must exist in one and only one resource group. But the benefit of this is that aggregates all the resources into a single manageable unit, makes things a lot easier to manage. Imagine if you had 1 million resources. I've seen subscriptions this size where you've got 1 million resources and you had them literally spread out with no organization. There are some that are going to have resource groups of 2 or 3 items, and that's it. There may have resource groups that have 1,000 items. That's fine. But as long as you have, it allows you to organize things so they're much easier to manage overall. Let's talk about subscriptions. As I showed you, let me go back to my portal here. This was a subscription I showed you. The subscription is what provides you with authenticated and authorized access to an Azure account. Now, what it allows you to do, go back to here, it provides 2 things: a billing boundary, so you'll be able to get invoices and billing reports on everything in that subscription. And there's other ways to actually make that a little easier to manage down to the smallest minutia. I'll show you that one in the future. And also, it manages and controls access to the resources that users can provision within specific subscriptions. And I know that sounds a little crazy, but regardless, just so you know, too, there's also, you can have multiple subscriptions. So in addition to having multiple resources spread across maybe 500 resource groups, you can have multiple subscriptions. Now, keep in mind, a resource group is in one subscription, a resource is in one subscription. But maybe you want to break things down. Say you work for a company that's doing a large web application development. You may have a subscription simply for development. You may have a subscription for QA, quality assurance. You may have a subscription for production. And you keep different instances live in each subscription. So there is a dedicated boundary and they're isolated from each other until you decide to move one to the other to the other. For example, when you're doing things like DevOps or CI/CD pipelines, in the future, we'll talk about that kind of stuff. You might go through different iterations where you're keeping these things isolated until they're ready to be promoted. My friend Raf, he says, "Good evening, Corey. Salute to you. Great knowledge. I'm willing to learn about cloud basics and networking." My friend, I appreciate that. When you get a chance, go check out Raf's sports channel as well. If you want, buddy, put the link in the chat. I'd love to share it out for you. Now, in addition to, pardon me, my phone's making noise. In addition to resources, resource groups, subscriptions. Now we have one more add on top, and that's management groups. Let's blow this up as large as possible. I'll take a little spotlight down here in the left corner. You'll see here up the top, you've got management groups. Management groups can contain multiple subscriptions. A subscription can contain multiple resource groups, and a resource group can contain multiple resources. But remember, a resource can only be in one resource group, which is in one subscription. But the management group can house all this. Now, the reason why this hierarchy is awesome is because you can apply permissions, security, automation, you name it, at different levels. If you want certain parts of security set only for these items, these resources, you can apply it at this resource group level. So that way only things from here down are affected. If you want to affect these items right here, where you've got these two resource groups along with these four resources, you can apply them to the subscription level where everything from the subscription below is affected by the permissions or the allowed access rights that you're putting in. And then finally, like I said, you've got the management group. This is the root level of everything. You can apply, say, things like identity and access permission controls, where you put into effect, say, things like multi-factor authentication, where they have to use either a text message. Let's do it so we can actually say, hey, there he is. You can use a text message, or you can use things like Microsoft Authenticator in addition to, wrong thing there, I apologize. In addition to your normal password login. You can have things like you don't want to allow normal users to log in to the subscription level. Maybe they have to be special administrator accounts, or what we call fire accounts, where like break in case of they only have permissions at a certain amount of time for a certain length. They have to be approved by their manager. There's different kinds of permissions we can put in place to do this kind of stuff. So things to know about this, the subscriptions inherit, and that's the thing, is the permissions are all inherited from their parent. So the resources inherit their permissions either directly or from the resource group. The resource group inherits their permissions from the subscription, and the subscriptions inherit their permissions from the management group. Up to 10,000 management groups can be part of a single directory. And a management group tree can support up to how many? 6 levels of depth. Tip alert. Remember these. 10,000 management groups can be supported in a single directory, and a management group tree can support up to 6 levels of depth. It's very unusual. You'll see a question that specific, but you never know. Maybe it's part of a question where they're asking you a scenario where, hey, Joe Smith or Jane Smith has a design question. They want to put 11,000 management groups in a single directory. Is this allowed? True or false? Yes or no? Yes, but only the first 10,000. There might be different answers like that you have to look at. The AZ-900 exam, they will typically not try and trick you on the questions. Microsoft got away from that years ago. Years ago, it was very tough. They would have multiple choice, multiple answer, or scenario-based questions. You had to go back, and if you had read this part, you forgot that one little piece, you get the question wrong. Especially on these entry-level exams, they're fairly straightforward. There might be one or two questions that kind of like make you think, what the heck are they talking about? But the key here is, if you've done your studying, if you've gone through this boot camp, if you've read the homework, you can at least know out of the 4 answers, maybe you know automatically that 2 of them are dead wrong. And maybe you're down between 1 or 2 possible answers left. If you're down to 2, it's a 50-50 shot. Maybe you take a look and say, it's yes, or there's yes, but only the first 10,000. And you can sit there and say, well, I remember reading about a limit of management groups, and then you select the one saying 10,000 management groups or less. Process of elimination in your head, learning to figure out how to read questions is just as important in taking the exam as studying this information. And in the final week here, when we do an exam review and a test review, I will show you different ways to study, not just for the technical information, but how to take the exam as well. Moving on, let's create an Azure resource. This is the fun stuff, guys. So let me share out my Azure portal again. Here we go. I'm just going to click back on home. Let me bring myself back down here to the bottom so the screen's a little larger. I guess it's not too different. We actually do that way we had it before because, hey now, there we go. Now it's out of the way. We're going to create a simple virtual machine. So what I want to do is click on create a resource. And I want to just do a simple virtual machine. Now, there's two ways to do this. You can either create a resource, type in what you want. So you're going to type in virtual machine. You click on virtual machine. And it brings up the Azure Marketplace. I'm not going to worry about private offers now. We'll just close this out. You can learn about that in the future. Here is a simple virtual machine. We can click on create virtual machine. And this brings us up here. This is the create a virtual machine homepage. Another way to do this, just go back to home, type in virtual machines up here on your search bar, click on virtual machines, and it says there's no virtual machines to display. Well, you can either click create here or create down here. Let's create an Azure virtual machine. And the first thing is, what subscriptions are going to go into? We only have the one subscription. We're going to keep that one. I don't have a resource group, so we have to create a new one. So we're just going to call this one Big Bald Azure Guy, BBAG, Test VM Resource Group. It always pays us well when you're creating instances of any Azure resource to have a standard naming convention. In this case, my company or my training is Big Bald Azure Guy. It's a test VM, and it's in an RG, a resource group. So I'm just going to click OK. The virtual machine needs a name. We're going to call this one Test VM1. I'm going to keep this in US East Region 2. And as you learn, as you play around with Azure, you'll learn more and more that certain things are cheaper in regions than they are in other ones. I just happen to know for a fact that US 2 is a little cheaper than US 1. Not much, but as I said, I've got a $100 limit per month that I can play around with this, so I don't have to worry about that really. Availability options. Do we want to have the VM deployed in multiple availability zones, zone 1, zone 2, all 3 zones? Because this is just a test, I'm going to have no infrastructure redundancy required. Security type, we're going to do just standard basic security for your VM. You can pick what image you want to create it with. You have different versions of Ubuntu, 2004, 2204 LTS, SUSE Linux, Red Hat Enterprise Linux, Oracle Linux, Debian, Windows Server 2022. We're going to do, actually, or we can just go see all images. Let's take a look. We'll select an image. Let's do, oh, well, here we go. Let's do Windows 11. You take a look here. You see Windows 11 is an option. Let's click back out of this, and we're going to select which SKU do you want. Let's keep this as simple as possible. We're just going to do Windows 11 Pro. Here it is, Windows 11 Pro 22H2. And it says this image is compatible with additional security features if you want to add them. So we're not going to swap the trusted launch. We're going to keep just the basics. We're going to do an x64 architecture. ARM is not supported with the image. You could run it with an Azure Spot discount. What if you hover over the I here, what this says is Azure Spot offers unused Azure capacity at a discounted rate versus pay-as-you-go prices. Workloads should be tolerant to infrastructure loss as Azure may recall capacity for pay-as-you-go workloads. What this means is if there are spots in a data center, spots in a rack that aren't being used, you can create your hardware, your virtualized hardware on that part of the data center because it's not being used, and you get a substantial discount. The problem is when it goes up and is being used, your stuff goes into hibernation, goes into sleep, so you're not going to be able to use it. So things like Azure Spot are great for playing around with stuff that is not essential. Production should never go in that one. We're going to leave that alone for right now. We're not going to use that. Size. Take a look here. We see all sizes. This is every single size that's available, talking about how many virtual CPUs, how much RAM, how many, data disks, what they're used for. These E Series V4 are used for high memory need virtual machines. We're going to stick with very small and simple, a B2S. So we're just going to select B2S. If you see this, if you ran this full time, it would cost you right around $30 a month. That'd be 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's going to ask you for a username. We're just going to create a simple one here. Call it Azure Admin. We'll give it a password. It's going to ask you some basic security questions. Do you want to allow any public inbound ports? No, or allow selected ports. Typically, I like to say none. For demonstration purposes here, we're going to allow remote desktop so we can log into this machine once it's built out. But ordinarily, I suggest having no public inbound ports unless there was a specific reason you need one and you have security loaded up. Like I said, this is just for testing purposes, for fun, no problem. It's also saying, do you have an available license? Yes, I do. We'll go to disks, and it's saying, hey, what size OS disk do you want? We're going to stick with the image default. You have different options for hard drives. Do you want to do premium SSD for best production, standard SSD, solid state drive, best for web servers or lightly used enterprise applications, or a standard hard drive, which is best for backup, non-critical, or infrequent access? We want to show a little bit of speed, but not too much. We're going to keep the price down. We're going to do standard SSD. We're going to tell it when we delete the virtual machine, if we do, which we will because this is just practice, it's also going to delete the disk with the virtual machine. There are such things as key management. Do you use for encryption either a platform managed key, a customer managed key? We're not going to worry about that right now. We'll go into that in the future. We'll just say yes, platform managed key is fine. Do you want to do ultra disk? Ultra disks are premium premium solid state drives to the umpteenth level. Don't need to talk about them right now, but it does say they are supported in availability zones 1, 2, and 3 for the selected VM size of standard B2S. We're not going to do that because that runs the cost even higher. We don't need any additional data disks, so we'll leave that alone. We click under advanced. We can say, do we want to have managed disks? These are for best performance. We recommend Azure managed disks for most virtual machine configurations. I highly recommend them. We'll go into the pros and cons of using them. There's more pros than minimal cons. So we'll leave that selected. Let's go into next, which is networking. And guess what? We have to connect networking. So there is no virtual network currently set up. Now, virtual network, these are logically isolated networks that are different from each other in Azure. You configure the IP addresses, the subnets, the route tables. If you don't know about security, don't worry about that. But the bottom line is if we want to have connectivity to the internet or from one virtual machine to another virtual machine, you have to have them in a virtual network. Now, by default, any virtual machines in the same virtual network can talk to each other by default. If they're in two separate virtual networks, then what we'd have to do is create some rules or communication to allow them to talk to each other. And that's where you talk about things like subnets, allowed ports, firewalls, security groups, just for your understanding. We'll get to more of that as we go on. So we're going to create a new virtual network. We're going to give it don't worry about subnetting right now, people. This is all just basic stuff. We're going to keep it as we're going to select the 10.0.0.0/24 subnet. Ordinarily, unless there was an absolute need to, I would not give it a public IP. This is a reachable IP address from the outside publicly to a virtual machine. Since I said we're doing just test purposes, that's fine. It'll create a new one automatically called test VM1 IP. Right now, we're going to have a basic network security group. We'll learn about that in the future. And it's going to allow on that public inbound port, port 3389, which is for remote desktop. Now, what it's telling you here is because of these network settings, it's giving us some warnings. This will allow all IP addresses to access your virtual machine. This is only recommended for testing, and that's what we're doing here. Also, too, once we delete the public IP, this is nice. Delete the public IP and the network interface card. So the IP and the network card when the VM is deleted. Same way we had the storage deleted when we delete the VM. This will automatically delete these extra resources as well. That way you're not having them sucked up for extra spend. So we'll delete that as well. We're not going to worry about accelerated networking right now. We're not going to worry about load balancing. Load balancing is where you can have this virtual machine as part of a group behind what's called a network load balancer that alternates either based on criteria or kind of a round robin effect. Send the first one to VM1, and the second one to VM2, the third one to VM3, and so on, and up and down, up and down. We're not worried about that right now because we're not going to be that advanced, but that's how it's going to be. Just for our purposes, no load balancing. Management. Defender for Cloud is the security software that's automatically installed as part of Windows 11. You could do things like system assigned managed identities, which we don't need to do right now. We could add, if we had a Microsoft Entra ID Active Directory, it used to be called Active Directory, Azure Active Directory. Now it's Entra ID. If we had an Entra ID instance, we could do logins with it. We don't right now, so we're not going to worry about it. And also, if you're playing around with virtual machines for the first time, I highly recommend setting up an auto shutdown. So what we'll do is we'll check this, and we will say every day at 10 o'clock p.m. And in my case, it's Eastern time. If I can find Eastern time. Where did it go? I know it's here somewhere. I passed by it. Right there, Eastern time, US and Canada. And I'm just going to have this go to Corey at Big Bold Azure Guy.com. What it'll do is it'll send me an email before it's going to shut down, so I can either skip or delay the shutdown. And every day this thing is running, it will send me an email. Sorry, every day that thing is running, it'll send me an email and shut the machine down at 10 o'clock at night. And it will not be brought up automatically unless you specify it to be brought up automatically at a certain time. It'll stay shut down, so you're conserving your spend rate. Remember, everything in Azure, everything in AWS, everything in GCP is pay as you go. So you've got to keep that mindset. If I'm not going to use it, make sure it's down, especially when testing. Now, there are certain things when you're in production with live environments at work that are never going to be taken down. I see here we've got Newman. He says, hello. Hello, Newman. Thanks for joining us. I'm glad you can be here. If you have any questions, please let me know. We're not going to do backups on this machine. We're not going to enable disaster recovery or any kind of updates, stuff like that. But these are all the options you have in management for creating a virtual machine. You can also talk about monitoring, where you enable alerts, you do boot diagnostics, enable application health monitoring. These are all extra things that I could spend probably an entire hour and a half on just this component. We're not going to focus on that today. We will just do simply the boot diagnostics that are automatically enabled with managed storage accounts, which we already have in place. I'm going to go to advanced. This is where you want to add some custom extensions, some VM applications, different custom data. This is really handy when you're doing large-scale deployments or massive deployments of multiple deployments at the same time. You can do Azure Dedicated Hosts for host groups, capacity reservations, things like this. We're not going to worry about it right now. Tagging is a big one. As I said, you can track everything billable. You can track in Azure via your subscription. What I recommend and what best practice for Azure recommends is you're going to create tags based on categories. So we're going to call, or based on names and values. A tag is a name value pair. So in this case, we're going to do this as category. The value is testing. Created by Corey. Purpose, training. You can do as many or as few as you want. But the benefit of this is when you go into looking at your billing resources, And we're going to select all 13 resources created as part of this VM. There is auto shutdown schedules, availability set, disk, network interface, network security group, public IP address, everything down to the VM or the virtual network. We're making sure that all of these resources are applied, have these names and values applied to those resources. So what you do is when you look at your monthly bill, you want to see what are we being billed for that was created by Corey. You can just go into your billing and say, everything created by Corey. Or what if I got somebody else in here? My wife was playing around. Michelle decided to create some stuff. I can find out who did what. I can't type all of a sudden. Now that that's done, we'll click review and create. It passed the validation you can see here up top. It tells you what the basic price is to run this machine. Will basically cost a little over 4 cents an hour US for a standard B2S Windows virtual machine. You're saying when you hit click create, you're basically saying I agree to the legal terms of creating this virtual machine. And it's also warning you again, you have an open port for remote desktop open to the internet. If you want to go back and change this, or if you're not sure, go back to the basics tab up here. We are sure, we're going to continue. We're just going to hit create. So as you can see here, it's initializing the deployment, it's submitting it, and they're doing a deployment in progress right now. Typically, this takes about, I would say, 5 minutes to do a complete deployment. So in the meantime, now that we've created a virtual machine, we're going to take a test, and we're going to take it for test drive when we're done here. Let's move on to the next slide. In the meantime, as you can see, it already stood up the NSG. It already stood up the virtual network. It already stood up the public IP. So it's getting there pretty quickly. Let's go back to the slides. And we're going to start focusing on compute and networking. As I said, there's your management groups. We did our walkthrough of creating Azure Resource, compute and networking. Let me get rid of my face here so we can see everything. Sorry. There we go. This is another objective domain. These are the things you need to be able to do for the test, for the exam, when you are taking it. So you are going to have to, why is my icon and my little logo in the way there? Let's take that down. There we go. Now we can see. And we're going to talk about in this part of the test, in this part of the training, and also what's on the exam, you have to be able to compare compute types, including container instances, virtual machines, and functions. You have to describe virtual machine options. As we went through there, we were talking about different options when creating a virtual machine. There's going to be all these different options. You have to know what they are, not necessarily how to implement them, not configure them, but what they are. So you're going to learn about virtual machine scale sets. You learn about availability sets, which you already talked about availability zones. I give you a hint. They're related. You're going to learn about Azure Virtual Desktop. You need to describe the resources required for virtual machines, which we kind of already walked through. You're going to describe application hosting options like Azure Web Apps, containers, different VMs for web apps and hosting. You're going to describe virtual networking, including the purpose of virtual networks, virtual subnets, peering, Azure DNS, VPN gateway, and express route. And then you also have to be able to define public and private endpoints. It seems like a lot, but what I'm telling you is almost everything you see here, especially in the virtual networking section, virtual subnets, peering, stuff like this. These will be used every day as you're working in Azure in a production environment or even just a test environment. So these things become very second nature. When I hear the word VNet or virtual network, I must deal with VNets 10, 15 times a day. I don't even think about it. I don't even flinch anymore because it's so common. And this is what will happen as you start doing this. They become second nature. It seems tough now. If any questions, please throw them in the chat. Leave a comment in the video. If you're not here live, I'd love to answer them for you and help you out. So going through compute services. As we talked about, compute is an on-demand service that provides computing resources like disks, processors, memory, networking, or operating system. So as we know, that's a virtual machine, which we just stood up. And let me show you here real quick. My deployment for my virtual machine is done. We're going to test drive that in a few minutes, but as you can see, that's how long it took. It took about 3.5 minutes to build out an entire virtual machine from scratch once I click create. Now, when you've created many virtual machines as I have, you can go through the entire click and click process in about 2 minutes. Now, what you can also do is you can do things called infrastructure as code, where you're deploying 50 machines at once in less than 15 minutes. And it gets very automated, very quick. And we'll learn about that stuff in the future. Not necessary for the exam, but it's one of those things that once you learn about it, you're like, oh, this is cool. I got to try this one. So I just want to give you a heads up. Going back to Azure Compute. As I said, it's an on-demand service providing computing resources like disks, processors, memory, networking, and OSs. And that includes things like virtual machines. That includes app services, container instances, Azure Kubernetes services, and Azure Virtual Desktop. So we just stood one up. What is an Azure Virtual Machine? Virtual machine, the pure definition, it's a software emulation of physical computers. Say you've got a laptop, that's a physical computer. Say you've got a desktop or a server, a hardware server, that's a physical computer. A virtual machine is let me do this, virtualized or software emulation of a physical machine. People might know the word emulator if you're big into gaming. There are emulators out there now for old Atari, Commodore 64, Nintendo, PS1, PS2, original Xbox. That is a virtual machine emulator of that hardware and software. Looking at this fully, what does that say? It's a software emulation of a physical computer. So you are having a software instance of another machine. So it includes a virtual processor, it includes memory, storage, and networking. As we talked about last week, IaaS, infrastructure as a service, it's an offering that provides total control and customization over these resources. A couple of cool things you can do with them. Development and testing. Azure virtual machines are a quick and easy way to create computers with specific configurations you require to code and test applications. The other thing is, because the demand for your apps, when you get them up and running, may fluctuate, it might make sense to run it on a VM in Azure, and then you pay for extra VMs when you need them, and then you shut them down when you don't. Remember, pay as you go. So this is the whole scale and elasticity thing we talked about last week. Last thing, extended data centers. Virtual machines in an Azure virtual network can easily be connected to your organization's network. So say you're running your own network and your own small business, you've got 15, 20 computers set up locally, and they log into a local domain with a username and a password. You can set up a virtual machine or something like an Azure Virtual Desktop or even a cloud PC to log into that same network with a username, password, and multi-factor authentication using your phone, your face, a biometric thumbprint, retinal scan, you name it. So this stuff's out there. The next step when talking about virtual machines is VM scale sets. These are load balanced opportunities to automatically scale resources. Like I said, behind a load balancer, you've got a load balancer in front. Let me actually kind of put my picture up here so we can talk about this. If you've got a load balancer on the left and you've got 1, 2, 3 machines over here, the load balancer is going to say, this goes off to machine 1, this goes off to machine 2, this goes off to machine 3. What this does is a scale set may start with just one virtual machine in it. But as demand increases, you need additional machines that have to handle and share the load. So instead of having these 3, you may end up having 6 or 10 or 20. And as the scale decreases, as the demand decreases or the the data traffic decreases, you can go up to 20, down to 3, down to 2, and maybe take it down to a single VM. It's the scalability and elasticity that allows us to go up and down, in and out as the demand increases for that traffic load, for that data load, you name it. So that's what scale sets do. They scale out when resources are needed, and they scale in when resources are not needed. Let's talk about virtual machine availability sets. In addition to availability zones, where your data centers are, there are virtual machines that are grouped in availability sets. So if we look at the diagram here, you have got a single VM, but you've got it set up across 3 different domains, 3 different fault domains in 3 different racks. So this rack contains virtual machine 1, and this rack contains virtual machine 4. What it may be here, now it's not clear based on the diagram, but what this might end up being here is that you've got virtual machine 1. Let me actually increase the size of the screen so you can see it a little better. VM1 may be copied over to this rack, may be copied over to this rack. So you may have 3 copies that are running as availability sets, where if this rack goes down due to hardware failure, electricity failure, power failure, catastrophe, weather, you name it, these 2 would pick it up automatically. This machine goes down because of a bug issue. These 3 have been updated. These 2 have been updated yet. They stay up. So just so you know, availability sets. These domains keep the virtual machines grouped so they can be rebooted at the same time without causing an outage. That's it. And they also group the VMs based on common power and networking. I am going to go through creating next week virtual machine availability sets. We'll have more information on them and how specifically they work. But let's just keep in mind, this is a high availability disaster recovery feature that enables your virtual machines to stay always on whenever you need them to. Now, let's move on to, I got to figure this out eventually. We did creating a virtual machine, so we're going to go past that one. Let's talk about Azure Virtual Desktop. Actually, in the meantime, while I'm working on that, I want to take a look at my virtual machine, and I am going to get a public IP address for it. As you can see here, let's add this to the stage. You'll see here I had a public IP address. I'm going to copy that IP address. I'm going to simply type in on my computer, remote desktop, the application. I'm letting that boot up. Remote desktop connection, and I'm going to connect to it. And let me share this out because I don't have this shared out yet. Present. Let's stop sharing that one. Let's present. Share screen, window. Remote desktop connection. So you'll see here, it asked me for username and password, and I had that Azure admin credential along with my password. We'll type that in. And it's telling me that, do I want to connect anyway to this? We'll say yes. We're going to remove that. We're going to add this back in because it's still acting a little funky, but I am connecting to it, which is nice. So we're going to stop screen sharing. We're going to add me back in. We're going to present, share screen, window. And as you can see, it's making an attempt to connect, taking its sweet time. But there is an active connection, remote desktop, to a Windows machine on the back end here. We're going to have a bunch of labs, a bunch of tutorials that you guys can follow it along with in our GitHub site. so you can walk through these yourself. This seems to be taking its very, oh, there we go. It is telling me, hey, choose your privacy settings. This is when you first boot up a Windows machine. So we're just going to click on next. We're going to accept, just go through this automatically. And look, I have a fully functional Windows desktop that is virtualized in Azure. Now you can't see the entire thing because it is just really large and my screen resolution is a little messed up here and a little funky. But as you can see, I can click on Edge. I can surf the internet from this virtual machine inside Azure. You can take a look at, oh, we're going to sign in to sync our data, all this kind of stuff. If we want to take a look at what files are available, it comes up with a base directory. Hey, here's my C drive. This is my PC. Remember we said 127 gig base drive? There it is. You have 107 of 126 gig free. It's got a virtual DVD drive if you want to attach an image or an ISO image. It's got temporary storage. Everything you see on a standard Windows PC is here. So what we're going to do, confirm and continue, without this data, confirm and start browsing. We could simply browse as we want to as normal. I'm just going to close this out for now because we don't need this right now. But here is our Windows desktop. And I could actually take this where I say, let's decrease the resolution so it's not quite as glaring and annoying. So we'll take a look at the settings. As soon as it comes up, now, like I said, this is a B2S. It's a little slower than you're used to because you have something very fast on your desktop. So you're only using part of the virtualization. You know what? We'll just leave this alone for right now. But regardless, you can see here now you've got a full Windows environment. It can be a Linux environment. It can be simply no graphical interface. It could be all command line, all that kind of stuff. A couple of things I want to show you really quick because we're closing in on about an hour and 10 so far. Let us remove this and let's share out Azure again. Another key important thing to remember here when you're working with Azure, let me bring this down here a little bit. You'll see at the top of the screen here, I've got a bunch of different icons. You've got what is here called the Cloud Shell. And there are certain things that you can do in the Azure Cloud Shell that you can't do anywhere else. You can either do Bash scripting or PowerShell. I have taught a ton of PowerShell courses. I know Bash as well, but I've always been comfortable in PowerShell. We'll just click on PowerShell. It's going to create storage automatically in that subscription. We'll just hit create. Should take about 30 seconds to create a storage account so I can go in there and do different things. Give it a second. You've also got different things up here like the different settings that are available. There is the support and troubleshooting menu. Feedback, you want to contact them directly. Notification button. This is where it told us that the deployment succeeded for our virtual machine and how much credit I have remaining. All right. So you take a look here. This is the Azure Cloud Shell. If you've ever used the command prompt in Windows or the PowerShell prompt in Windows, this is exactly what it is. And you can use anything you want in your Azure environment with PowerShell. So say we want to do get Azure, do get AZ subscription. And this tells us, hey, there's my subscription. If I want to get AZ VM, that tells us we have, as you can see here, an Azure virtual machine called Test VM1. The resource group name that it's in, Big Bold Azure Guy Test VM Resource Group, located in East US 2. It's a standard B2S SKU. It's a Windows operating system. That is the name of the network interface, and that it was successfully provisioned. So you have that to look at. You can also say get AZVM. We want to do Name, we'll call this one as we know it is, test VM1. And let's do, whoop, not nor, I apologize. You know what? We just spelled out exactly. We know we have test VM1. See, we want to find VM2. Is there one? Didn't get a response back. Let's do FT. Oop, sorry. We can do different things on here. I will walk you through, I will create a class for people who want to learn how to use PowerShell. Right now, it's not essential. These are just different things that you can do. You can do get AZ, hit tab. You'll see all these virtual networks. We want to do get AZ virtual network. There's your virtual network called test VM1 VNet. If you've ever used DOS, if you've ever used a command prompt, it's very similar. Each of these is called a commandlet. It allows you to run different small mini programs or mini apps on the shell to give you information you're requesting. Like I said, there are certain advanced things you can do in Azure that can only be done through here. And to be honest, it's actually much better at giving you the information you want, sorting out data, doing quick programs, doing quick scripts, doing quick tasks, automating a lot of items. This is something you need to learn in the future. But for right now, you're okay. Walter says here, much faster than setting up Proxmax on the old server I just took home as a hand-me-down from the office. Yeah, agreed. Setting up a virtual environment on an old PC can really take a long time and be really, it is satisfying when you do it for the first time, but I will tell you, agreed, it can really get to you after a while when it takes, because typically a lot of us don't have the funds to go out and buy large ESXi servers and do multiple SANs and everything else in the house. You're using old retired hardware and just to get it to work. And you know what? It's a great way to do it. But we also know it's very slow sometimes. All right. Coffee's gone. Now we're down to the water. That's a good thing. Let's move on here because we're bleeding daylight. Azure Virtual Desktop is a desktop and app virtualization that runs in the cloud. Basically, what virtual desktop is, it's a full virtual environment without having to run additional servers for connections, things like that. You can do true multi-session deployment. You can stand up one multi-session server in virtual desktop and Azure Virtual Desktop and have 25 people log into it if it's got enough resources to handle it. You can also have them hop machines in the Azure Virtual Desktop environment. They go either from pooled machines or personal machines. They can use the same hardware in the cloud at all times on a personal machine. If it's just pooled, it's first come, first serve, but they have the same login. You can use something called FS Logics on the back end, which allows you to have your same domain login, your same documents, your same NetApp files, your same net use commands that you have in the back end to access networked folders, no matter where you're at. When I started my new job that I've been at now, 5-6 months, it took them a week to send me a new laptop. Great. What they did the first day was they gave me a login. I used a virtual PC login my first day where I worked remotely on Azure Virtual Desktop. It was a cloud PC that was set up. It had all the information I needed. It had all the software I needed, things like Microsoft Excel, Outlook, Visio, passwords were all set up. And all I had to do when I got my laptop sent to me was just log in. Everything I had saved on my cloud PC was right there on my laptop once it's synced up and logged in the network. So that's one of the benefits of things like Azure Virtual Desktop. There is another exam called the AZ-140, which we could spend probably 6 hours going over how to set up Azure Virtual Desktop. You don't need to know about that for this exam. This is, what is it? It is a full desktop virtualization environment that you can access your files on. You can have pooled desktops or personal desktops, and it allows logins so you can work on a machine in the cloud as if you were sitting in an actual machine. That's all you have to know about Virtual Desktop for this exam. Moving on, Azure Container Services. We're getting kind of towards the end here, folks. We only have a few more to cover. Everyone knows the magic words, containerization nowadays. Containerization, things like Docker, Kubernetes. This is the Azure instance of it. Azure containers, they are lightweight, virtualized environments that do not require operating system management, and they can respond to changes on demand. This is simply what you have to know for the exam, not how to configure them, how to install them, how to stand them up. No. You need to know that container instances are a platform or PaaS offering that runs a container or pod of containers. A pod is a group of containers in Azure. You have to know that Azure Container Apps is a PaaS, platform as a service offering, like container instances that they can load, balance, and scale. And then Azure Kubernetes Service is the orchestration service for containers with distributed architectures and large volumes of containers. Let me tell you, you can dedicate an entire career to just doing Kubernetes, not even cloud based, just Kubernetes. So we're not going to dive any further into it than we need to now, but that is what Azure Container Services is in a nutshell. Know this page, know these 3 or 4 bullet points, you'll be fine for the exam. I recommend going into Microsoft Learn, following the pathways for the AZ-900, you'll be fine. But we're not going to go too deep into this because then you'll get lost in the weeds and it won't be fun. I want to keep this very high level, which is what the exam is for the most part. Azure Functions is something else to look at. It is another platform as a service offering that supports serverless compute options. Now, serverless computing is kind of the evolution of cloud platforms in the direction of pure cloud native code. Let's say serverless brings developers closer to business logic and insulates them from infrastructure concerns. You're keeping your code separate from your infrastructure. It's a pattern that doesn't imply no server, but rather less server. Serverless code is event driven. So this code may be triggered, say, when an HTTP or a web request, let's not say HTTP because some of you may not know, but it may be triggered by anything from a web request to a timer or the result of uploading a file. So a function may be simply, if this happens, this happens. If a file is uploaded, run a scan on it. If you get a web request, do this. If you get a timer set, once this timer's hit, send a report to these users. The infrastructure behind these functions allows for instant scalability to meet, once again, elasticity and scalability demands. And it offers, there's another word for you, micro billing to pay for what you use for function. Now, like I said, functions are very inexpensive, very cheap. It's a new way of, it requires a new way of thinking. Most people haven't looked at this and approach to building your apps. And it isn't the right solution for every problem, but they do exist. So make sure you know what Azure functions are. It's event-based code that runs when called upon without requiring server infrastructure. It's code that runs your service and not the underlying platform or the infrastructure. And it can create infrastructure based on an event. So just things to know. Let's take a look here at comparing Azure Compute options. We've been over virtual machines. We've been over virtual desktop. We've been over containers. Take a look here. Virtual machines are cloud-based servers that support Windows or Linux. They're great for lift and shift migrations to the cloud where you take your data, push it up to the cloud. They include the complete OS system. Virtual desktops is basically, it provides a PC Windows desktop experience. Virtual desktop is not Linux, it's Windows. Dedicated apps that can be used, multiple clients, multi-session logins. Containers, as I said, know this overlying architecture information about containers, but that's all you need to know. Lightweight miniature environment, well suited for running microservices, as everything in Azure, designed for scalability and resiliency through orchestration, which is Azure Kubernetes. And apps and services are packaged in a container that sits on top of the host operating system. Multiple containers can sit on one host OS. If you go back, like I said, to this slide, Azure Container Services, and this slide, they may ask you scenario questions. Joe Smith or Jane Smith needs a personal computer in Azure. What would you recommend is designed or implemented for him? Well, you know it's either virtual machine or virtual desktop. It would not be containers. Joe Smith or Jane Smith needs a small, lightweight environment to run microservices. Well, virtual machines or virtual desktop would be overkill. So you want to do containers instead. Those are the kind of questions we're looking at for the exam. How many do we have left here? We have, I'm just taking a look what we have here for our, we have 2 more slides to cover today. So we're going to cover Azure App Services. Azure App Services are it's a fully managed platform to build, deploy, and scale web apps and APIs very quickly. They automatically, you don't need to know any more than that. As I said, these are keys to work with coding, work with development in Azure. You don't have to be a developer to know what this does. As I said, it's a fully managed platform to build, deploy, and scale web apps quickly. Works with .NET programming languages, .NET Core programming languages, Node.js, Java, Python, PHP, among many, many others. And it offers enterprise-grade performance, security, and compliance. And finally, for our last slide tonight, we're just going to touch ever so briefly onto Azure networking services. We've talked about infrastructure. We've talked about virtual machines. We've talked about scale sets. We've talked about very quickly about load balancers, things like that. All these things we've talked about are your operating systems, your containers, your host OS, what you actually do the work on. Networking is now the communication that takes place in Azure or in your house. You have Wi-Fi set up. If you've got Wi-Fi in your house, you have a network set up in your house. This is the same type thing. You're talking about Azure networking. And the first thing we want to touch base on here, talking about Azure networking, is an Azure virtual network. Remember when we set up that virtual machine, we had to create a resource group. We had to create a virtual network. The virtual network is what the networking card is attached to communicate. Any virtual machine that was attached to that same virtual network can talk to each other by default. These are default routes, default rules in Azure. A couple things to not worry about. A couple things to remember when talking about VNets in Azure. They allow resources to communicate with each other, the internet, and your on-prem networks. We're talking about on-prem data centers, not up in the cloud. Maybe it's a local company that has its own little data center or large data center, and they run hybrid where they're talking about they've got public cloud up here talking to on-prem resources, you name it. There are public endpoints accessible from anywhere on the internet. There are private endpoints that you set up and configure that can only be used within your part of the network. There are virtual subnets that are segmented in your network to suit your needs. And it also network peering connects your private networks directly to each other. So you could have a virtual network set up dedicated to web apps. You can have a virtual network dedicated to just governing your virtual machines. And you want them to communicate with each other. So instead of doing all kinds of different fancy routes and fancy rules, you can say, I'm going to set up a virtual network peer between these two virtual networks. And what that does by default, when you put that VNet peer in place, is it allows communication between those two virtual networks so that the resources in those two VNets can then speak to each other. Now, there's other things we're going to talk about next week in networking, like network security groups, application security groups, that can override some of that stuff. But by default, you then put in the routes that are available and the base security that's necessary for it to say, okay, VNet 1 can talk to VNet 2 if they're peered to each other. Not too difficult, not too crazy, but it's one of those things we want to make sure that we talk about at a very high level. Now, I know we've covered a lot of stuff tonight. The things we're also going to cover next week, we're going to cover more networking. We're going to do some walkthroughs and configuring network access, talk about VPN gateways, talk about express routes, talk about Azure DNS, a lot to go through. What I would definitely suggest, and I'm going to bring this up again here. Let me go back into Microsoft Learn. I'm going to leave this, and I'm going to go into AZ, if I can find it. We're going to search for AZ-900. Not what I was looking for here. I apologize, folks. So exam AZ-900 products, AZ-900 exam. Why is it when you want to find something, you really can't? But as I said, okay, so you got different things we can do here. So we're going to look and we share out this page. We're going to add this. We've got things like Microsoft Azure Fundamentals describe Azure management and governance. We're going to talk about Azure Architecture and services. What I want you to do, as we discussed in the first video, is go through, start working through these. Today we did Azure Compute and networking services. We're going to touch on next week the rest of networking and Azure storage services, and also identity, access, and security. What we're trying to do is build up a gradual knowledge so that this becomes second nature for you. The AZ-900 is a lot of times people's first exposure to Azure, what it is. I want it to be interactive, have demonstrations, make it fun for you. Once we finish the 900, we're going to move on to the AZ-104 administrator exam, which will, probably end up teaching not just once a week, but twice a week, because there's a ton we have to cover. And it is quite honestly probably the biggest exam out there because it covers just about every component of Azure you can think of. You have to be a jack of all trades just to pass this exam. So work on the Microsoft Learn, focus on anything that says Azure Compute, focus on Azure networking, fundamentals, review your cloud fundamentals. And as I said, next week, we're going to touch on Azure storage, Azure identity, security, and compliance, which includes Entra ID. That's a fun thing to look at. Hopefully my slides get a little better next week, and hopefully we have a lot more time. I don't think we're going to go much past this hour and a half window because, as I said, people start to lose what's going on. They don't want to be glazed over. As always, folks, this is a lot of fun. If you really enjoyed the content, I appreciate it. Hit like, share it to your friends, hit subscribe, share it out to your coworkers. I'd love to talk to you. Look, and as I said, if you are looking for information, please hit me up on LinkedIn, sign up for the Discord channel, send me a private message. I'll help you out however I can. This information should be free for everybody to look at, should be free to use. And it's just, I want everybody to know that they can do cloud and it's for everybody. Walter, once again, man, thanks for being here. I'm looking forward to seeing you next week as well. Walter's reached out to me a handful of times. I think on LinkedIn is what it was. Please join the Discord server. I'd love to have you on there. You guys can talk about any certifications you're going through right now, any journeys you're going through, issues, difficulties, wins. A couple shout outs there. My friend Antoine AJ Winbush passed his AZ-900 about a week and a half ago. Has a nice little article up on Medium. I'm going to put a link to that in the comments as well. A couple of my other friends who want to remain nameless right now, but they passed their 104 and the 305. So we got people passing stuff every single day. This is great. Please don't hesitate to reach out. Hit like, subscribe, turn the notifications on to see the next training. And if you have any more requests for different kinds of training, please put them in the comments. With that said, we'll see you next time. And as always, keep on learning.